Well, operating right now, invisibly, is your perspective on the world. Just sitting here now, things seem a certain way, right? Uh, Maybe you feel like a normal, everyday Sunday morning self, as the body mind kind of does its magic to make it like this and perceive the world. And perhaps you have some sense of, a path. You're drawn to this particular series of talks. So already something's operating that says, something's going on with this life. You're examining your life. And so how we see the world frames how we feel, it frames everything we do. And so these fundamental teachings that we began to introduce last week, the sense of the human dilemma, of suffering, but also the potential for something that's far more awake, liberated, less stressful, uh, can also be known, can be acknowledged. The very idea that there's a path is already a dawning of right view, meaning that we're beginning to see each of us, uh, that the human experience, our daily experience, is worth examining, which is wise, that's right view, and that there's ways to examine it skillfully, that's right view, and the actual path that the Buddha named was based on his examinations. And so learning from another is right view. So let's point, if we can, to this present moment of experience as much as possible. So this is not abstract. So critical in everything that we're doing. So what are we doing right now? I'm talking. There's listening happening. You're hearing words. And is it making sense so far? Do you understand what I'm saying? Pretty basic, nothing complicated, right? But there's something very beautiful that's happening as we're doing exactly this, nothing fancy. There's the voice of another, in this case, me. There's wise attention, in this case, you. And those two coming together, that's the prerequisites the Buddha named for the arising of right view. Right? So there's a kind of a mind-to-mind transmission that happens through language. In this case, not entirely through language, because you're watching all kinds of other things about this display, even over the pixelated internet. That's fine. But actually noticing that we're practicing right view. It's not just what our view is, we're practicing it right now. So we're on the path. The path is never distant. If there's one message of this whole series that I want to just name and name again and again, and hopefully you just maybe even get bored with it because, well, yeah, Greg, you already said that. Of course that's true. Perfect. That's perfect. When it's internalized like that, as of course the path is always here, then the details they can follow. I'll talk about details for sure, especially, we've got 40 minutes to fill. I can't just stop right now. But Tuesday, we'll talk about actual practices. Thursdays, we go into some depth. But here we want to get a real sense of what is samadhi, what is this right view, and how do we practice it? So clearly it's the first step on the path because there's no sense of a path, there's no right view, right? So that's critical. But interestingly, it's also the culmination of the path because right view, wise understanding is a synonym for panya, for wisdom. So the awakened mind, the awakened heart seeing things as they are is the description of one who is rested naturally, without effort, in a wise understanding of things, has a perspective. One of my teachers, Venerable Punaji, he relanguaged a lot of stuff. He was a lot of fun, but also very deep. And his languaging of this was harmonious perspective, right view, harmonious perspective. Harmonious with what? Harmonious with other people, for sure, because the selfishness that comes with the wrong view of the self-enclosure is simply gone, but also harmonious with the notion and the life oriented towards waking up. So harmonious with liberation, in a formal sense, harmonious with the Dhamma. So our basic views that we're born with, we should be humble as we approach this, because on the one hand, is and seems so simple, but the humbling part is to recognize the extent to which our views are formed by our upbringing and our society. I mean, it's really some heavily built-in stuff where we feel safe or unsafe in the world. There's whole psychological theories, attachment theory, and so on, that talks about the sort of the micro development of that feeling of being in the world, relating to others, of feeling safe and not safe. That's a view. But it's, you see, we begin to really come very immediately to that fact. View is not some intellectual thing. Intellect is very tied in, and we'll talk about that. But the essence of DT is a perspective that's operating, and we don't even know it. It's just, it's what makes things seem the way they are. So right view is a harmonious way of seeing things, but the view in the fundamental sense, because we could have wrong view, is we just see reality this way. It's not a thinking thing. Thinking is included in it, but it's how it lands. So one example of that we're all, operating from, not all the time, thank goodness, but I dare say most of the time, is kind of this view of myself, who I am, how I am in the world. And it comes out of, as I said, how my parents were with me and my siblings, all my friends, the conditioning that came up. It's sort of also angled, if you will, by my genetics and the inclinations that the body-mind has as a result of that. And also all the culturally formed perspectives that we have about, let's say, political freedom and political imprisonment, about justice, about the economy, not to mention gender, skin color, and one of the great repositories of views, religion, philosophy, life perspective. So one of the important things about the Dhamma, should we understand it clearly and take it in skillfully, is that we have the opportunity of being, shall we say, confronted with or provided with a perspective that is outside that culturally familial conditioned system, which means it's going to challenge us, right? Where it's different from our scientific upbringing, or where it's different from our religious upbringing, from our national, understandings and so on. And we're seeing that, the views that operate within our family, about what kindness is and how important generosity is, how you handle anger, all of those things that's formed collectively. And at the social level, uh, view is not only formed collectively, but constantly reformed and reinforced by our media intake, by even the serious reading that we do, the films we see. And we also can easily imagine how important our ongoing current relationships are in reinforcing certain perspectives and inviting new ones and invoking challenges to our view. That's one of the beauties of true diversity, is the challenges and the expansion of our views limited by all the things we talked about: family background, views limited by our skin color and how we were treated by society, views limited by our economic privilege or lack of such, and so on. So this aspect of samadhi, right view, informs every factor of the Noble Eightfold Path. One way of understanding that is just what we think, let's say, right intention or right mindfulness is, to the extent that it's aligned with sort of the Dhamma perspective that understands suffering, the end of suffering, cause and effect, that understands the skillfulness of the whole of the Dhamma. Well, that's wise understanding about right mindfulness, about what mindfulness is, or what right intention is, what right concentration is. So we can see that the whole path, the light that is shed on the path, is that light of wisdom. And so respectfully, we understand that our views have been forming our entire lives. We're sometimes find places where it's kind of rigid and locked in. I certainly will admit that. You can think about whether you want to acknowledge that in yourself. But the good news, and I'll talk about this a little more later, the good news is that the mind is plastic. We can learn. And right view is built on that fact. If we were really locked in, what's the point? Why have a path? Why do anything at all? So right view is a practice, and that's where we're going to launch now for really the rest of this talk. So how do we cultivate this wise understanding? So I'll give you a couple of examples. Here's one from the discourses. There's the Buddha saying, when I was unenlightened, still a bodhisattva, I was watching my mind, and I would, as thoughts came up, I would say, oh, this thought, that's associated with sensual lust. And I'd put it over here. And another thought might come up, and that's associated with relinquishment or renunciation. Put it over here. Wholesome, unwholesome, in terms of its cause and effect. Oh, this is a thought that's associated with anger. How absolutely human of him to see his thoughts of his unenlightened mind associated with anger. Does it sound like something you could do? It does to me, right? This thought is associated with non-anger and kindness, warmth. Put that over here. Here's thoughts associated with cruelty. Yes, the Buddha was unenlightened at one point, and he describes this process. So the point is, he's sorting his thoughts. Now, the sorting he was doing, the categories in that particular discourse, either when he actually spoke the discourse or as it became filtered through, the first few hundred years of handing down the teachings, who knows? but they were framed in terms of the categories of right intention, sama sankapo, which we'll talk about next week. But the point is the process. See, it's a practice. So he was engaged in the practice of watching his mind. So if I pause for a moment and give you a chance just to observe your own mind, take a look at what might be operating now, right now, as we sit in silence together. That's wholesome. Maybe there's some unwholesome, but be sure to acknowledge the wholesome as well. Perhaps curiosity, respect, care. Maybe there's some little fish swimming by of fear or anger, who knows? So, exactly what you've just been doing for the last half minute, the Buddha did most of his life. That was his practice. That's how the Dhamma was born. It was born out of examining his own mind, his own experience, his body mind. That's not just the thinking mind. Examining his experience and saying basically what's going on here. So, the key piece in this and the basic policy of our time together is ehipassiko, come and see. Come and see. See for yourself. And that's a practice of right view. You see what I'm saying? And it's never distant. Doesn't matter whatever other path factor or what you're doing, how crazy your outer circumstances are. You're running out the door. You grab your keys in your purse or your wallet right there. It could be a little moment of watching the mind, wholesome, unwholesome, boom, you're gone, you're out the door. It doesn't have to be formal sitting practice or any such thing, any time at all. You're reaching for some cheese. It's in the mind. You see what I'm saying? It's just that close. Ehipassiko, come and see. Now in meditation, that come and see becomes a very specific, refined practice, and it can be quite profound because as the mind gets quiet, more still, and if your practice is skillful, there's a wakefulness to what is the nature of this experience, even without the words asking that in the mind. It's just a quality of Dhammavijaya, of investigation, of phenomenal experience. And that is one of the factors of awakening, Dhammavijaya. It's associated with right view, with wisdom. And you're actually looking closely. It's ehipassiko, come and see. Only now you've set aside so much of the noise. You've set aside the other distractions. And as there's a refinement of the observing field, the field in which you're observing, that practice of right view is basically no different than what you did as you were grabbing your keys, but just that much more refined, specific, intentional, and the signal to noise ratio is good. You can see the signal of what's going on because the noise has been reduced as you sit quietly. So something that we're going to talk about in more depth on Thursday, especially. We'll mention it in practices on Tuesday, but we'll go into more detail on Thursday. is the role of thinking on the path, and the role of thinking, especially in relationship to samadhi, to right view. So there's a common and understandable misunderstanding um, amongst communities of meditators that, by and large, that thinking is a problem. And actually, thinking is one of our uniquely powerful capacities. In the case of the cultivation of wise understanding, that in the working is that we're harnessing the linguistic and intellectual capacities in service of the wise understanding, and therefore in service of the whole life path. Because what we're able to do is bring in specific teachings. We're able to examine um, uh, our experience in terms of how does it fit in relationship to, let's say, clinging or perception or generosity. Each one of those things, right, is words. Metta is a word. But it's a word that points to an actuality. We're going to go into a lot more detail on that when we get to right speech. But the importance here with right view is that the thinking mind has been thrown out as problematic by Vipassana meditators, by Zen meditators, and understandably, it gets in the way because, especially in our culture, it's given so much weight and is used so profoundly unskillfully. And it becomes a thing in itself, built around tension and servicing self-making and greed. Just like anything else, any other power that we have is going to be put in service of the mind's, the heart's tendencies. But actually, when thought is used skillfully to guide the mind, what we have, we open up a movement, a kind of a pathway, a trajectory from conceptual thinking by way of contemplation and reflection into intuitive understanding, into wisdom. If we avoid that first step by distancing, by disrespecting our linguistic capacity, our intellectual capacity, then what we're setting aside, what we're leaving out of our active, whole life, noble eightfold path is really, in some sense, the Dhamma, because that's, a system that's expressed in words and says, come and see. How are you going to come and see? Even when you sit down to watch the breath, forget about all the fancy stuff like impermanence. Impermanence is a word. You use it and you say, oh, is there anything that's like, what can I notice now? Oh, the mind, it's not stopping. I can feel the vibrating of the senses now. But the word impermanence just pointed, it's just a finger pointing, drop the language, right? You can do that all the time. But what about just the potential for any of the teachings to be posed and then what's being experienced now. So as I was about to say about breath, even when you're just breathing, if you say, oh, I'll come back to my breath, that's words. Don't be scared of them. Just drop them as soon as you've used them. One of the great blessings of insight dialogue is that you learn to use language and drop it. You get skillful at that boundary. The point here, as far as the practice of right view, is that this practice of reflection and contemplation, which many of you know from Insight Dialogue or from any Dhamma study, the practice of contemplation is a pathway by which the practice of right view can enfold the entirety of the teachings. Nothing left out. No teaching left out. So come and see for yourself. So as a teaching that I refer to a lot when I'm speaking about right view, but really it's such a nice window into the Buddha's understanding of the path. And he said that right view is assisted by 5 factors: morality, learning, means learning like what we're doing now and reading and so on, although it was mostly a pre-literate society. Discussion, these are practices. Tranquility and insight. So morality is, as we began to understand last week, and we'll really dive into soon with the factors of right speech, action, and livelihood, is a very subtle practice of discernment. What's true, what's useful, what's skillful. And so in doing so, expanding out beyond the selfishness of the individual separated me and being in the world as a dynamic experience is a very rich, muscular practice of right view. Learning and discussion. I like to highlight those because, again, our preconceptions about the Buddhist path often leave that out. Learning and discussion. So your friendships where you talk about what's going on in my life with a light of wisdom shining on it. Your practices of insight dialogue. Your practices of Dharma contemplation. Reading the suttas before you go to bed at night. These are all framed so beautifully by right view. Now, these contemplations can have the starting point of the Dhamma. So let's contemplate together this discourse, or let's contemplate dependent origination, and so on. And let's let that wisdom aspect shine light on actual experience and see what we learn, right? And many of you know that well, especially if you've practiced insight dialogue. So I'll move now to the next one. What about contemplations that begin with life itself? Not unlike the Buddha sorting his thoughts, but also just examining, like, why does this hurt? Why do I feel lonely? What scares me? What scares me here? Something is scaring me. What is that? What can I go back behind it? What am I holding on to, and why? Why does it feel so good to give? Why does it feel so good to love? Now, if the way that you're engaging those reflections keeps you in a perspective that is, built around self-view and, or certain kinds of, let's say, religious or psychological views that are maybe don't have the liberative perspective, then they can still be beneficial, of course, but they'll be much more limited in their impact. So when we ask those kinds of questions, where we begin with life itself and how we feel about things, we still need to check in on where am I coming from as I'm asking that? What's my reference point? What's my sense of, to quote the Buddha, of morality, or of what's my sense of anicca, dukkha, and anatta, of the impermanence of things and the insubstantiality of self and so on. So, but it's good to know that these are all part of, potentially part of skillful practice. There's also a whole body of practices that the Buddha references when he says, uh, you know, virtuous behavior, learning, discussion, calm, and insight. Insight. So insight practices, come from, in essence, refining the mind to sit intimately with experience and to see what we don't usually see. If you were to condense it, it might be something like that. And so what something is experienced in these insight moments that's beneath or below the threshold of language. Now, after such an experience, we can come back up and give it words, and we do this reviewing process that is natural to the human. But also, when you re-enter your life, it's like, whoa, things are different, and you're examining, well, what is this? What just happened in this process where I was, let's say, meditating, and somehow things like became more refined. And there's many ways of describing these kinds of experiences. Some of them feel glorious, some of them are very scary. But the point is that these classical insights, they're accessible to all of us by practice. One of the classical insights has to do with nama rupa, the relationship of body and mind, or mentality and materiality. And just by, even as we sit here now, you might, if you want to do this, just notice your hand, actually move your hand, and then ask yourself, well, is that hand material? Is it physical? But noticing that how you know it is sensation, which, the pleasant and unpleasant quality of sensation. Perception, there's a hand, it's just a perception. So mind is knowing, hand, that's a perception. And all of a sudden it's like, wow, what's in here and what's out there? You know what I'm saying? What's material? What's physical? What's the knowing of it? Now, right now, in a mundane state of mind, unless some of you are mid-retreat and I just nailed something down for you, I don't know. But normally that just looks, well, of course, there's my hand, it's physical, it's got flesh and blood in it, I move it because I've got a brain. We have all this framework. But when the mind gets very still, those solidity of that, this is how things are, comes into question. And one can begin to notice the way mental function, body-mind function, constructs the world a certain way. But I'm giving words to it, which is, risks trivializing it. But the point is that when we talk about right view, insight into the basic nature of experience, is a important part of the process of the practice of right view. So let's talk about another experience which would be familiar mostly, or maybe even only, I don't want to say that, but it's most likely for those who have experienced insight dialogue, especially on retreat, there's an experience where the self shell, the sense of boundedness and solidity of the me in here begins to soften. And the person that you're practicing with is likewise experiencing that. And when that kind of relaxing of those bounds and the brightening of sati is happening between the two of you, and there can be a dropping of the kind of the hard nut of me in the middle, and there's a quality of not self in relation. So it's quite a paradox of not self completely, but also still in relation. Now, right now, again, you can see the challenge that I'm using words in a mundane, more or less mundane situation to point to an insight experience, which is a great lesson in seeing how subtlety of what we can know and perceive through meditation can shift our understanding of the human experience. But to talk about it is not only risky, it's partial. And I'll leave you with one more classical kind of insight, just to give us a sense of and respect for how these are all practices of right view, right? That's the key abiding point in everything I'm saying. You see many times in the discourses where there's a naming of an experience of maybe moving through the various refined states of absorption, the jhanas, but then not associated with jhana, just associated with the depth of practice, the cessation of perception and feeling as a momentary experience. And the point is that such report of experience is followed by, and the intoxicants ceased to flow, the abandoning of the intoxicants, right? The detox process has had its kind of ultimate leveling up. Why? Why would the intoxicant cease to flow after such an experience? So if you can, I'll just share a story actually here. I used to be a scientist at the Santa Fe Institute, where they were famous for studying complex systems, developing chaos theory and artificial life and, complex adaptive systems and all this. There was a man there who, a young scientist who had been in a hang glider accident. So basically he went off a cliff and he was out there high, and then just the drafts didn't support him. He just went down. It's like the ultimate nightmare, right? His body was so broken, so destroyed, that he was just in a hospital bed in coma for, weeks, months. I don't know exactly. Let's say a month. And he was kept alive by tubes and drugs. And he describes the experience of watching consciousness come back. So he sees, just little flickers of just bare experience. Like in the beginning, there was light, Bereshit from the Bible. It's like, wow, okay. And then he watched life assemble itself over some period of time in the hospital bed. This is directly analogous to the way Venerable Puniji describes emergence from absorbed states and watching the self assemble itself. So why would this make a difference? Well, you've seen behind the Wizard of Oz's curtain. You've seen that there's just, some little guy standing on a platform turning wires, and that little guy is just, the frantic little you that is, building up this world to try and get by and survive. But once you've seen through it, then all of the worries, all of the grasping, it doesn't necessarily, the circumstances aren't all solved. Life is still complicated. You still have a body. There's still relationships, and they will always be complicated. But in the words of the Dhammapada, the ridgepole of the house has been shattered. Right? That core belief in I am, and I got to take care of it. I can take care of it. I can be in control of this thing. And in fact, that this thing is the way I see it. You no longer believe it's the way you see it. The point here is that this is all pointing to a shift of perspective. So you see the connection between freedom and right view, right? And why I said at the beginning, this is the beginning of the path, but it's also the culmination of the path. So close by noting that I've talked a lot throughout about both individual practices and interpersonal practices and our engagement in society, which are forming and reforming our view. I want to highlight again the profound significance of spiritual friendship in cultivating samadhi, wise understanding. When we do this together, think of all the benefits that we get. Think about the perspective that I gain from talking to you, because you've had a whole life of different experiences from me, different meditation experiences, different understanding of Dhamma, but also all of the other things in your life that have contributed to your understanding of the human experience. Think about how when we're together, mindfulness gets sharp and sustained in this between, when we're reminding each other, like right now, to be awake. Think about how when we talk together, two of us, or maybe all of us here, this is spiritual friendship. We're all together examining this thing of wise view, right understanding. But this spiritual friendship that we have, built around aiming the mind in a wholesome way, see how it keeps the mind on topic, sustaining the investigation, not wandering off. Sometimes I'll close an insight dialogue contemplation on retreat after, let's say, we've been contemplating one thing for a solid hour, hour and a half, and I'll say, well, so how would that have been if I just said, go off in a corner and think about this for an hour and a half? We just know it wouldn't work, don't we? I certainly do. I know it wouldn't work. I'd like, oh boy, this is getting boring, or my mind would go who knows where. But think about how we sustain that quality of investigation, not just intellectual investigation, but not leaving out the intellect. The investigation of immediate present moment experience together. And the support of community to sustain these things. So it's recollection of this plasticity of the mind, that right view, the practices of right view, work with this fact of plasticity, that the intellect is not left out, can be skillfully used, but we don't depend upon it because there are insights that transcend not only concept, but language entirely. And that the aim of non-clinging, of goodness, of a mature way of being in the world is all supported by this ehipassiko, this come and see. So there's some foundation, and I'd like to open it up to any questions or investigations that might be alive for you right now. And I can also share with you, just as a reminder, that on Tuesday, our time together will be devoted entirely to practices, to be examining different practices. And then on Thursday, we'll be going into more depth in this aspect of contemplation and the role of the thinking mind, the wholesome role. Lots of people talk about how unwholesome thinking is in meditation, and conceptualization gets in the way. We know that's true. But we're going to also look at the wholesome role, the power of the mind, on Thursday especially. So, here we go.
Thank you, Gregory. Wonderful talk. I'm reminded of a teacher, Bhante Guttaratana, who used to always say, you must see things exactly as they are. And I've often wondered about what he meant. And I was hoping that you might be able to speculate on that a bit and perhaps tell us how that's possible.
Would it be okay if I start by saying it's not possible, and then we can go from there?
That's fine.
Because, I mean, no matter what, the mind, let's get a little more, shall we say, juicy, and just say the brain, the hormones, the body are always constructing the experience of so-called, what we call reality, always. That's just, there's no way around that. That said, the experience that we have, usually the mundane, if you will, experience of life, is so far from the actuality that there's this enormous territory we can traverse as we get closer and closer to that constructing process. Because that constructing process can be known, and that's what we were talking about before in the subtlety of insight, right? Beneath that, there's just flux. There is no there. There's only flux. So any attempt to say there's a there at the middle of it and a this is going to understand the there, I can't agree with that. However, humbly, we recognize that as I see the world, it's completely conditioned by prior perceptions, prior contacts, thoughts, my emotional state, my siblings, my parents, they're all here when I just look at my bookshelf or look out at a tree. And so the way I see that, or the way I interpret a relationship, let's say with an intimate one or a neighbor, the way I say, oh, well, that's what's happening. My neighbor is behaving like this. And I say, that's how it really is. Oh, give me a break. Give me a break. How much do you think you actually know what's happening between you and your neighbor? You're coming from your preconceptions. He or she's coming from their preconceptions. And somewhere in that morass that you call experience is this joy or this conflict that's happening. So if we just spread that and say that's how we usually experience the world in this very distanced way, it's conceptualized, it's emotionalized, it's prefabricated, it's stereotyped, we've got intrinsic biases, on and on and on. That we can do a lot better. And so as we begin to notice these fabricating processes, how painful they are, to notice how unskillful we are when we act from all of those preconceptions, those implicit biases, those fears, and so on. And then, of course, you might say that the subtle tool of meditation is one of just really looking at that. That's why meditation is so hard and often so gritty, even painful, because you see, hopefully with humility and kindness, you see, these constructing processes and your limitations and so on. And hopefully there's enough love there to accept that and enough wisdom to know that that's just part of being human. But then as you do so, you're getting closer and closer to actuality. But when you get there, there's no there. So no, it's not possible. But each of us can do so much better. I'm guessing, if you've been meditating for a while, which I know is the case, that you've seen that happen. If nothing else, look at some of your political, religious, racial, gender biases. Maybe those have begun to let go. That's also part of the path of wisdom, right?
My question is, when you brought up the word paradox, and I think it was referencing the non-self in relation. I think that's what you had said. And looking back, I'm curious as to having come into self and relation work 30, 40 years ago with Jan Surrey, and how significant that has been to my own practice. And coming into the Buddhist non-self and thinking about to know the self is to forget the self. And that practice has been front and center to my work profession. And I'm thinking about when you're talking about emptying out or of whatever these many things are that get in the way of being a non-self participant in the insight dialogue practice. Anyway, all of these thoughts are swimming around, and I'm wondering how you came up with the word of paradox and if that has some relevance to understanding this practice, in particular of becoming intuitive, as it becomes deeper into our way of being. And I don't know, anything that you could share around that would be appreciated. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, if I can keep that as intimately close with the path and especially with right view, paradox refers to two things that are both true, but also mutually exclusive. So it's basically something that's impossible, but that's actually happening. That's the paradox. And in any paradox, like not self and self, or not self in relation, like how can there be a relationship, or how can there be being in relation when there's not a self to be in relation, right? That's where the paradox lives. But the point right now, because again, talking about an insight experience is of limited value. Not, it doesn't have no value, but we should recognize that there's going to be some futility there. But the point is, to address your question, that if we allow ourselves to enter into, to stand next to the impossible, the paradox of, in this case, not self and relation, but it could be the paradox of emptiness and the fact that life is actually happening, or any number of paradoxes. Just to be able to stand in the impossible involves a relinquishing of control, the relinquishing of the, shall we say, utter confidence in the thinking, conceiving mind. And from that standpoint, it's a very useful practice of right view. This opening to the unknowability is part of right view. Because ultimately, remember, a key teaching on view is the Buddha many times and very explicitly, don't cling to any views at all, including a Dhamma view. Here we are, all not clinging to views together. It's lovely. So may our efforts together be of service to beings. May our humanity become well cooked and soft. May all of our practice together benefit beings. And I hope that whatever is here to serve you on this, through these talks, through going online and meeting each other, practicing together, if I could just really encourage you to practice this week with right view specifically. It just is the foundation for everything we're going to do. So finding a partner would be good. And engaging in your own reflective processes, your meditation practices, observing your life, ehipassiko, come and see. And so may this serve all beings. There's so much suffering in the world, and knowing this suffering, being open to this suffering, is also wise understanding. Letting it in, letting it touch, and knowing that we're not separate from it is also wise understanding. No separation of compassion and wisdom. That's a myth, a protective myth. We let it go. May all beings benefit. May there be peace. May there be peace. May there be peace. Thank you, friends. See some of you Tuesday, some of you Thursday, some of you next Sunday.